Not only to change the narrative, but start telling the truth. It's time for kids to know, all kids of all kinds, and grown-ups to know, all kinds, that black history didn't start with slavery. If you haven't introduced your students to Anthony Browder's Nile...
When we speak of black history, it is essential to recognize that it extends far beyond the confines of slavery. It is a rich tapestry woven with the achievements, innovations, and legacy of ancient African civilizations.
It's time not only to change the narrative, but start telling the truth. It's time for kids to know, all kids of all kinds, and grown-ups to know, all kinds, that black history didn't start with slavery. If you haven't introduced your students to Anthony Browder's Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization, you haven't done your students a fair job. If you haven't introduced your students to the book Stop Falling for the Okie Doke, you haven't done your students a fair job. It's time for these kids to hear from Robert Wald Sussman's book, which is The Myth of Race, that this whole thing is a myth. And it's time to stop believing the myth. And it's time to stop teaching the myth. And it's time to realize that blacks were doing cataract surgery with metal instruments before there were hospitals in Europe. It's time to realize that blacks were intelligent, creative, adventurous, curious, brilliant people before you white folks evolved. It's time to start teaching the truth. If we don't start teaching the truth pretty soon, people, we're in really big trouble. It's time to start teaching the truth. Now, white people aren't going to be happy with those truths, but eventually they'll be better off. Eventually they will realize that they have been myth-read for the last 400 years. It's time to give up the myth. It's time to tell the truth in history. People, what were the names of Columbus's 3 ships? People, Vine Deloria says he left the old country with 4 ships, but 1 fell off the edge. Now, it makes as much sense to tell that as it does to tell that Columbus discovered America. People, you can't discover a place where people are already living. They discovered it before you got there. It's time to demythologize the schools and history. We are not teaching history, we're teaching hysteria. It's time to start teaching the truth. You could make a huge difference just by doing that for 1 day at a time. Just 1 day at a time. If you tell your kids something they have never heard before, and they go home and tell it to their parents, especially, as mine did, and one of the parents was the head of the school board, it changes the way the system operates. Because that parent has to start thinking in new ways in order to get along with that kid. You want to make home uncomfortable, people, by telling the truth. We need some discomfort.
When we think of black history, it is often overshadowed by the narrative of slavery and oppression. But the truth is, black history is far more expansive, diverse, and profound than what is being taught in textbooks. Today, we embark on the journey to rediscover the rich tapestry of black history, starting long before the transatlantic slave trade. Ancient Africa was home to remarkable civilizations such as the Kingdom of Kush, the Mali Empire, and the Great Zimbabwe. This society thrived with advanced architecture, sophisticated trade networks, and rich cultural traditions. From the vibrant cultures of West Africa to the monumental achievements of ancient Egypt, Africa's diverse heritage laid the foundation for countless contributions to world civilization. The scholarship of African thinkers like Imhotep, Pantotep, and Ibn Khaldun laid the groundwork for fields such as mathematics, philosophy, and medicine. The University of Timbuktu was a center of learning and scholarship, attracting students and scholars from across the continent and beyond. The African diaspora further enriched global culture and society. From the music of the Caribbean to the art of the Americas, the influence of African culture is undeniable. Black history is a story of resilience, resistance, and triumph over adversity. From the Haitian Revolution to the Civil Rights Movement, black people have always been at the forefront of fighting for justice and equality. As we celebrate Black history, let us honor the legacy of those who came before us, recognize the contribution of Black people to humanity, and continue the journey towards a more inclusive and equitable future. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of Black history. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe for more exciting discussion. Together, let us rewrite the narrative and ensure that Black history is celebrated and remembered in all its richness and complexity.